Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten.
On today's program, our subject is going to be Conservation is Conservative. In order to discuss that very, very interesting topic, I'm pleased to welcome to the program Jim DePeso. Our guest is the National Communications Policy Director of Republicans for Environmental Protection. Our guest holds a baccalaureate degree in communications from California State Polytechnic University. Mr. DePeso, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Coeur d'Alene and to our campus and to our studios.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm very pleased to have a visiting panelist member today, a colleague of mine at North Idaho College on the faculty. Dale Marcy teaches chemistry and environmental science, and I shall invite Dale to commence the question today with our guest.
Pleasure to be here with you today, Jim. As someone who teaches environmental science and looks at the issues that have occurred recently in the United States, one of the first things, of course, I'm sure you get asked many times is, okay, where did the Republican Party change directions? What happened from the days of Richard Nixon and the passing of the NEPA legislation and the starting of the Environmental Protection Agency to be where we are now, where the party seems to be diverging significantly from those policies?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Dale. It all started pretty much in the early 1980s, and I think the appointment of James Watt as Interior Secretary kind of symbolized what was going on. There are a number of things that happened that caused the environmental issue to become much more polarized now than it is today. Number one, there arose within the Republican Party a faction of very hardcore market-oriented ideologues who got into their heads this notion that conservation is an element of the liberal big government welfare state. That was number one. Number two, the socio-political complexion of the environmental movement did change, starting in the 60s and 70s. Before that time, the movement was very much mainstream, middle class, bipartisan. But starting in the 60s, there were more, shall we say, liberal left counterculture elements that came into the conservation movement. And a number of the more conservative adherents to conservation felt a little bit alienated, didn't feel quite comfortable with these folks. And over time, the movement came to be seen as just an arm of the left wing of the Democratic Party. But I think primarily the most important reason is, and John McCain has been talking about this for years, is the influence of special interest money on our political system. There is no question that the inundation of special interest money has corroded our democracy, has given a louder voice to the interests that have a short-term interest in using up our natural resources. And so money is just inundating our system and really threatens to drown it. And that really is the most serious issue that has caused this divergence that you just mentioned.
I have a follow-up question from Dale's fine opening, and that is that from a historical perspective, he mentioned that the Nixon administration was very friendly to the environment and very significant legislation was passed, but we can go back further.
Sure.
Probably that no president has been more appreciative of the environment than Teddy Roosevelt. And so would you take us back, and then in Western politics, Governor Tom McCall, a very popular governor of Oregon, was a very successful Republican governor who was certainly an environmentalist. I think you could put Governor Dan Evans, who was governor 3 times and very popular in Washington, got very important legislation passed. So both in more recent time and all the way back to the beginning of the century, give us some more information about particularly the influence of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, a lot of history, I think, has been forgotten in this country in terms of how much good conservation was accomplished by Republican leaders. Theodore Roosevelt is certainly the most famous Republican conservationist, but it even predates him. In fact, right in the middle of the Civil War in 1864, Abraham Lincoln found time to protect the Yosemite Valley. President Grant signed the legislation that established Yellowstone National Park. But Theodore Roosevelt really set the gold standard for Republican conservationism. He saved 230 million acres, which is about equal to the combined land area of Idaho, Montana, and North and South Dakota. 18 national monuments, 150 million acres of national forests, 5 national parks, 51 national wildlife refuges. In fact, the very first wildlife refuge that he established on Pelican Island in Florida, he essentially did at the stroke of a pen. In those days, the fashion was for women to put feathers in their hats. That was just the thing to do. And so these birds on Pelican Island were being slaughtered by feather collectors. And this was brought to Roosevelt's attention, and he asked his aides, well, is there any federal law that would prohibit me from establishing a federal bird reservation here? And they said, no, Mr. President. Takes out his pen, says, very well then, I so declare it. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had a strong personal interest in wildlife and conservation dating back to his childhood. But more importantly, his most important insight was that conservation was essential to protecting America's strength and security for the long term. He said, in fact, that conservation is a moral issue because it's our patriotic duty to secure the safety and continuance of our nation. That was his most important contribution.
Also, President Theodore Roosevelt was not only an advocate of a certain policy, but he lived that. He loved the outdoors and travel.
In his time, he was one of the world's foremost authorities on North American game mammals. He was a crack birder. I mean, he could go out and tell what species of bird that he heard a song for. He was a big game hunter. He was a naturalist. He wrote books on natural history that even that make interesting reading today. So, and again, this dates back to the influence of his father and his uncle, who instilled in him a deep love of the outdoors. But you mentioned some of the other leaders. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt was not the only Republican conservationist. Calvin Coolidge established 13 national monuments, including a 1.5 million acre monument in Glacier Bay, Alaska. Herbert Hoover expanded our national park system by almost 40%. By establishing monuments in the Southwest. Grand Canyon, Death Valley, what's now Arches National Park, were all set aside by Herbert Hoover. The coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was set aside by President Eisenhower's Interior Secretary to protect its wildlife and its wilderness values as well. Now, you mentioned certain governors. Tom McCall was certainly, he set the gold standard at the state level. He got more than 100 environmental bills through the Oregon legislature. In my home state of Washington, Dan Evans, 25 years after he left office, Dan Evans to this day says that environmental protection was his proudest accomplishment. In Michigan, Bill Milliken was very aggressive with his conservation leadership, protecting lakes, beaches, wetlands, so forth. Governor David Cargo in New Mexico. So there are a lot of good examples of Republican conservation achievement.
Thank you. Del Marcy.
That was quite a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to more recent times, you say that money now influences the Republican Party. Why do you think the Republican Party was selected for the influence instead of the Democratic Party?
Well, I think the Republican Party historically has been business-oriented, and that's good. We're all in favor of strong businesses and prosperous, profitable businesses. So I think that was part of it. The Democratic Party has historically been aligned with more interest group politics, labor unions, minorities, and so forth. But I think it's just the amount of money that has just flowed into our system has just gotten completely out of hand. That's why Senator McCain, has been championing the cause of campaign finance reform, because it's just corroding our democracy.
Can I have a follow-up on that one? So a lot of this money right now seems to be coming from the fossil fuel industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties us to our overseas issues.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's any way to disengage our internal Republican Party from that external issue?
Well, what we're saying on this particular issue is that moving to an energy transition, to move away from fossil fuels, diversify into alternative sources, renewables, and so forth, really is a fantastic business opportunity for this country. I mean, especially in the rural areas out here in the West, where you have a lot of distressed rural communities. Wind is a crop that farmers can grow. Biomass is a crop that farmers can grow, and with prices that are a lot more reliable than commodity crop prices. Another point that we would like to make is that we really do have a national security issue here. Our dependence on Middle Eastern oil is dangerous. 2/3 of the world's proven oil reserves are in the Persian Gulf. This is a part of the world that is chronically unstable. It is ruled by vulnerable autocrats and pathological predators, and it's just a tar baby that we have to get ourselves off of. Thomas Friedman, a columnist for the New York Times, has said that the most important thing that President Bush could do for his country in terms of combating terrorism and building national security would be to lead an aggressive transition away from foreign oil. And really the only way to do that is to reduce our dependence on oil, period, because that commodity is a global market.
Yes, you talked about several commodities that could come from the heartland, but this heartland is very big. We're very dependent upon transportation, and transportation requires oil. So what can we do about our oil dependency?
Let me paint a picture here for you. Renewable sources of electricity, such as wind and solar and biomass, they can be used to produce hydrogen. What we really need to move toward is a solar hydrogen economy. The hydrogen will be the fuel that will supply automobiles with the fuel for fuel cells. And hydrogen burns cleanly. You can produce it here in this country from a variety of sources, and the only thing that comes out of the tailpipe is warm water. That's it. No carbon monoxide, no greenhouse gases, no toxins, nothing. That ultimately is the future for transportation, is the hydrogen fuel cell. And virtually all of the world's major automakers are doing some serious research to perfect and commercialize this technology, but we need to do a lot more, and that's why we need some federal leadership in that regard.
I'll follow up on that question too, and that is, since it is technically doable, and it sounds like it would be so kind to the environment, is what's causing it to move slowly? Is there a lot of expenditures in this transition, or is it trying to sell the consumers of America, or are they special interest groups that are making their money other ways, and they would oppose this diversifying of the energy?
Well, I think the consumers of America, we all have cars, we enjoy our cars, and as long as the cars do what we want them to do, we really don't care how they work, just as long as they get us to where we want to go. And I think consumers are very excited about these new technologies. Where the problem comes in is, I think, resistance from today's conventional energy industries. Not all of them. Some of the oil companies do get it, like BP. They say now that BP stands for Beyond Petroleum. They are looking ahead. They are looking ahead several decades and realizing, someday we're going to have to find an alternative to oil. Why not start now and ensure the future of this company? There are other interests that would rather resist change, stick with the conventional fuels, even though eventually the transition is going to come. We can either have a smooth transition and with some federal leadership, or we can have a rough transition when prices start to go up, or we become more and more dependent on the Middle East, or we have where the global warming problem starts really kicking in the next century, and we have to make an abrupt transition. Better to start now. And these technologies, a lot of people say, oh, they're 20, 30, 40 years away. Well, maybe, but technologies have a way of just suddenly exploding on the scene and becoming ubiquitous. How many people in this room 10 years ago had a cellular phone? I didn't, and I'll bet neither of you had a cell phone either 10 years ago. That technology has just exploded in the last 5 years. The same with the internet. And we think the potential for these clean energy technologies is along those lines. With some concentrated research and development and some federal leadership, we can get these technologies into play a lot faster than people think.
Also, since we, as Dale indicated, and you in response to this question, is we've been so dependent on importation of over 50% of our energy, that if we could start developing that at home with this rich country and this vast country, that would do a tremendous amount to affect in the economy and future employment, would it not?
Oh, absolutely. The Bonneville Power Administration and a number of other entities did a study last year on the business potential of what they called clean technologies, fuel cells, solar, wind, geothermal, and certain energy efficiency technologies. They estimated that over the next 20 years, there will be $3.5 trillion of investment in these energy technologies globally, $3.5 trillion. We should get a share of that business. we could, and the Northwest is well positioned to serve as a foundation for that business because we have federal labs here, we have top flight universities, we have a culture of business innovation in this part of the country. Why shouldn't we get a share of that business? Why let the Danes and the Germans have it? Why let the Japanese lead? Let's not make that mistake. Let's get ahead of the curve and really develop these technologies. They will provide new jobs, new industries, again, another source of support for rural economies, and tremendous export opportunities because there's 2 billion people elsewhere in the world who have never used an electric light. Well, they want electric lights, they want refrigerators, they want everything we have, and we can sell them the clean energy technology that will enable them to do that.
And also would change international politics.
It sure would. Yeah, it sure would. And if we are able to extract ourselves from that Middle East tar baby, that can only be to the good.
Thank you. Dale Marcy.
Lester Brown, in a recent book, The Eco-Economy, describes a process of transition that he thinks the United States should take. From your position in your organization, do you agree with some of the strategies of changes in our taxation structure?
One of the things that we think that we should look at in this country is tax shift. And by tax shift, what we mean is let's tax the bad stuff and not tax the good stuff. For example, if we were to impose a tax on carbon emissions, we could offset that, or more than offset that, with reductions in income and payroll taxes. And of course, as Republicans, we would prefer to more than offset that. Income taxes things that are good, people's labor, the good that people contribute to society. Let's tax the bad stuff that we don't want, and that's carbon dioxide and other pollutants. So we should look more seriously at tax shift. A number of European countries have done that. I think another thing we need to do is, as we did with the space program, we need to have the federal government help spur markets for these technologies by buying them. Okay? I want to see every federal bureaucrat behind the wheel of a hybrid electric car in the next 10 years. I want to see solar panels on the roofs of federal buildings. I want to see wind turbines and geothermal plants in our military reservations. By purchasing these technologies, that will create a market that will drive prices down. You'll create economies of scale. That's exactly what happened with gas turbines. The military invested in gas turbine technology, perfected it, drove the price down. Same with the internet and computers as well. I was showing my kids a newspaper ad from my college newspaper in the 70s, and it was an ad for hand calculators. And I showed my 15-year-old son, who's a computer whiz, take a look at that price there. $250 for a hand calculator that today you can pick up at Target for what, $5? Those price reductions were partly the result of the space program that invested in these technologies and drove the prices down and enabled them to get out into commerce. We should do the same with energy technologies.
We also saw that even with the space program, the revolutionary changes in the medical field and how it helped save lives in advance. Your title, and I introduced it, and you'll be speaking in our city this evening, but conservation is conservative. And
that's our slogan.
Yes, yeah. And it's very, very attention-drawing. Many people have a confusion also between conservative and liberal. Would you explain from your slogan, and this region here, there's the conservative philosophy is very predominant, so in your opportunity to speak to that population, explain why conservation is the conservative philosophy rather than a liberal philosophy.
Well, first of all, conservation, we believe the importance of conservation transcends political philosophies and political parties, but there is enormous consistency between old traditional conservative values and conservation. This goes back to the days of Edmund Burke. I mean, a lot of kids at this college who may be taking English history classes may be familiar with Edmund Burke. He was a British philosopher and statesman, and he's often thought of as the father of modern conservatism. And one of his principles was that society is an intergenerational contract, which means that today's generation has a responsibility for the well-being of future generations. And another British conservative, 200 years later, who some people may know by the name of Margaret Thatcher, said, this generation does not own the earth. We have only a tenancy with a full repairing lease. That was Margaret Thatcher who said that. Edmund Burke, many years ago, said that prudence was the cardinal conservative virtue. If he had to pick one conservative virtue out of all of them, he would pick prudence, which basically means look before you leap, don't make radical changes without very good reasons. And the way we apply that to what our environmental issues today is that the Earth really is our life support system. It, unbeknownst to us, ecosystems around the world provide clean air, they provide clean water, crop pollination. These ecosystems balance our atmosphere, keep our atmosphere warm and hospitable. And we really need to take good care of those ecosystems because they are capital assets that return dividends, much like an investment in a stock or a bond. These ecosystems are capital assets that return dividends in the form of clean air, clean water, crop pollination, the other things I just mentioned. So we think we should manage those investments conservatively so they'll continue to return those dividends years and years and generations into the future.
You very effectively articulate your slogan, Del Marcy.
If we went out in this area and did a survey, we would find that many of the people in this area consider themselves environmentally oriented, but yet, as Tony mentioned, most people in this area vote Republican. How can that be explained when the party doesn't seem to woo people that have an environmental leaning?
Well, if you look at polls, and I know polls have their drawbacks, but polls show that time after time after time, they show that the majority of Republicans do care about conservation and protecting the environment. I think where the problem is that for the reasons I mentioned earlier, a number of our party's leaders have kind of gotten off track. They've forgotten, what Richard Nixon accomplished in the early 1970s with his 37-point environmental platform. And he didn't just passively allow that legislation to pass. He pushed it aggressively with the Democratic majority in Congress. And I think for the reasons I just mentioned, a lot of our leaders have gotten off track. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way. Even President Bush, we've registered a number of criticisms of his environmental policies, but I think the man does have a personal conservation ethic. His ranch has geothermal power. He has a rainwater collection system for irrigation. He and Laura are planting native grasses, Texas native grasses. So I think the man understands the conservation ethic, but I think the influence of all these special interest groups has really gotten our Republican Party leadership off onto the wrong track, and that's what I think we need to correct.
So you think until the changing in the funding of our government and our elections, until that changes, we're going to continue the way we are to be dominated by big oil and big coal?
I think that until we really get a handle on the influence of special interests and what they are doing to our election campaigns, moving to that energy transition I talked about is going to be difficult, and that's just the way it is. And like I say, Senator McCain has been hammering on this theme for a number of years. That was one of the reasons why we elected to support him in the year 2000 during the Republican primaries, was that he was saying if you look at any public policy issue, not just the environment, but health care and others, you find that the influence of big money is coloring and corroding the debates that we're having in Congress. Now, a lot of members of Congress get very upset with Senator McCain. He really doesn't care about that. When you spent 5 years getting beaten up in a North Vietnamese prison camp, the criticisms of Senator Lott really don't faze you. But he's absolutely correct. We have to fix that problem in order to have a clean slate so that we can have honest debates about these issues. Now, that doesn't mean that Republicans and Democrats are going to agree on the best policies to pursue for cleaning up the environment and conservation. There are a lot of good Republican ideas, like the use of market tools, that we need to look seriously at. Democrats have their own ideas, and we're going to debate those. But let's have a clean, honest debate that's on the merits of the issue, not colored by the short-term agendas of those special interests that Theodore Roosevelt fought in the White House. Every day he was in the White House, he fought those people.
One of the reasons why he's called the Trust Buster, he was a really a very, very energetic man. Time is fairly short on the program now, but not only from the internal decision-making of this country, but globally speaking, are you an optimist about the future of dealing with these issues of conservation of this small planet, and what do you anticipate will happen?
Yes, I am, because the political cycles do change. In this country, we've had a history of long wave cycles that come and go, and I think we're about ripe for a new reform cycle, a new era of Theodore Roosevelt. And I think time is of the essence. We can fix these problems. We can fix our energy problems. We can address the issue of global climate change. We can conserve our public lands. But for a lot of these issues, especially the climate issue, we really do need to start now, because if we wait 30 or 40 years, it's going to be that much more difficult to get a handle on these problems. So now's the time to get into action. And this is the country that put men on the moon and won World War II. So if we can do that, we can fix these environmental problems. But we do have to start now.
And our final question on the program today is about your organization, Republicans for Environmental Protection. You're nationwide, and you have support throughout the country.
We have small clusters of members around the country. We have clusters of folks in California, the Northwest, Illinois, Florida. They're in pockets here and there.
And a number of the people in your organization are actually in political office too.
We have a few members of Congress. Congresswoman Nancy Johnson of Connecticut, who I hope is going to prevail in the November 5th election.
We should say we're doing this program in October and it'll run in December.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Congressman Chris Shays of Connecticut, Congressman Walsh of New York, and we have a number of state legislators around the country as well who are members. I mean, we don't actively seek out elected office holders, but if they want to join, that's fine. Yeah.
And I'm sure you have members that are from some of the conservation groups in the country too.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, we have members. I mean, you'll be surprised how many Republicans are in the ranks of like the Audubon Society,
right.
Sierra Club, wildlife, the various wildlife federations, and so forth. So they're out there.
Yeah. And the Conservancy.
The Nature Conservancy. Yeah, they're out there.
Yes. On that note, we bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of Del Marcy and our staff, Jim DePacio, thank you for being here. You're most articulate, and it's been really fun interviewing you, and I'm sure our viewers have learned a lot about your position and your organization. Yeah. Again, good luck to you in your work.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you too, Dale.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've enjoyed bringing this program titled Conservation is Conservative with our guest, Jim DePacio. We've enjoyed having him as our guest, and we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week when we'll change the subject. And until then, we wish you a very good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.